Everybody. Today we're going to be talking about Kalabox. Kalabox is a local development solution. My name is Mike Pirog. I'm a co-founder of a company called Tandem. I also, it's okay, also co-founded a company called Kalamuna, which more people might be familiar with. Tandem is fairly new. If you went to DrupalCon New Orleans, Kalamuna was the company that threw the funeral parade for Drupal 6 and had a giant balloon. So I live in San Francisco, but I'm originally from Boston, so I appreciate coming to Chicago for two reasons. One, it reminds me of how cold it is when I grew up, and two, it reminds me how awesome it is when a team that's cursed finally wins a World Series. So congratulations to all of you for that. I know that and you've already eclipsed the best sports moment of your life, so you might as well just stop watching sports now. Nothing will ever be as good as that. That's certainly been the case for me. Anyway, I'm the CTO at Tandem. Tandem is a fairly new company. It's not Drupal specific. We deal mostly in modernizing apps and workflows. So if you're a company that really wants to do GitHub flow model workflows, or wants to do automated testing, or wants to have deployment pipelines, and wants a company to come in and sort of set all that stuff up so you can do more dev cycles and you can save time, we're sort of a company to do that. We also do a lot of trainings, and we also are the inventors of Kalabox, which is what we're going to talk about today. So what is Kalabox? Great question. I provided the answer in a slide. The answer is that it is many things. First and foremost, it is a local development environment. So if people are familiar with things like MAMP or Vagrant, or Drupal VM, those are local development environments. But it is a little bit more than just that. It is both a product and a framework. And what I mean by that is similar to Drupal is similarly to Drupal. Drupal is both a product and a framework. You can use it out of the box and it can do stuff. But it's also a framework insofar as you can actually use it to build bigger and more complex things. You can think about Kalabox the same way. Out of the box, it does a lot of really nice, useful stuff. But you can also use it to build bigger and better local development environments. It ships as both a GUI utility and a CLI utility. So if you're someone who's a GUI hater, you can use the CLI. If you're someone who thinks CLI tools are stupid, then you can use the GUI. If you like them both, then good for you. You've not gotten passionate about something that's ultimately not that important. To sort of riff on that last idea, because it's a GUI and a CLI, you get sort of push-button ease of use, and you also get the latest sort of tech, which is great. And by latest tech, I specifically mean Docker. I don't know if, show of hands, people have used Docker at all. Awesome. So Docker is a CLI tool. It uses Linux containers on the back end. Are people familiar with sort of the containers versus VM sort of debate at all? If not, that's okay. We're going to get into that a little bit more. Kalabox is fast. It's advanced. It's easy to use. Another sort of way to think about it is as a platform as a service emulator. So you can think about something like Pantheon, which is this giant platform where you host your sites. You can think about Kalabox as something that basically takes that whole platform and throws it on your computer for you to use. So you can do lots of really neat stuff with it. And then the sort of nice thing at the end is that it is free and open source. So I'm not trying to sell you on any products directly here. You can get it at the following two places. We prefer the first one, so we can get your email, so we can talk to you about all the great Kalabox things. But if you're someone who is offended by giving their email for a free and open source product, you can go to GitHub and download it on our releases page. So why would you use something like this? One of our great Drupal friends, Jeff Geerling, who is the inventor of Drupal VM, and I linked to the blog down there, although I think you probably can't even see it very well, but I'll post the slides later. Wrote out 9 sort of great things that a local development should have. The reason why you should use Kalabox is we have all 9 things, and those are the 9 things. So if you like those things, then you should consider using Kalabox. I'm going to go over some very basic parts about Kalabox right now. I'm going to probably blow through this a little bit quickly because this is somewhat more technical, and I feel like that's maybe not the best way to go right now. But just give you a sense of sort of what it is and how it works. So people here, are they familiar with using like Vagrant-based VMs or like MAMP or something like that? Okay, so there's some familiarity with that. And you can think about sort of Vagrant sort of on the left-hand side of this axis, and Docker on the right. Another way you could say this is sort of virtual machines and containers. You can think about this top axis as sort of where most sort of VMs, local VMs fit, which is that they're very heavy on the VM side, very heavy on the Vagrant side. And Kalabox, which is on the bottom here, is much closer to the Docker side of things. So instead of using VMs, instead of the traditional sort of, we're going to spin up this whole machine on our computer and use it, we're doing these microservices, these small containers that we can use for different sort of apps. And I'll explain how that works in more detail as we continue. But I feel like this is a decent visualization. Or actually, that's not true. I feel like it's a bad visualization, but it's somewhat helpful to describe sort of where the lay of the technology is for these things. So normally in like a Vagrant sort of based stack, you have an architecture that's very similar to this, which is you use some sort of configuration management tool. Puppet and Ansible and Chef are the ones that are most widely known. You can also just use Bash or something like that. And you use that tool to basically spin up a computer on your computer, a virtual machine. And that computer is usually like Ubuntu or something like that. And you install Apache on it, you install MySQL on it, you install sort of all these things on it. And then on top of all those things, you put all your sites, which are those 4 big things right up on top there. And that's totally great if all your sites run on the same stack all the time, but that's hardly ever the case. So if you wanted to have a stack that ran sort of a different version of PHP or a different version of Apache or a different version of MySQL, and you have VMs, you have to have multiple VMs. And anyone who's tried to manage multiple VMs on their computer knows that does not scale super well. So this is one of the main problems that Kalabox solves, which is because we use containers, which are much more lightweight, we can actually spin up 4 or 5 different containers for different services to match up with each site or each app you're working on. So you can have a backdrop site that's running, the normal backdrop stack. You can have a site spun down or pulled down from Pantheon that's running, the stuff that Pantheon runs. You can have like an Express app if you're doing like mean development and have it sort of have the stuff that it needs. So instead of having this one big monolithic stack, you can get exactly what you need for each app. That's really nice because it sort of eliminates the works on my excuse computer and sort of eliminates potential shame that you might feel pushing code up to production or test or development branches and watching that break in front of all of your peers. And shame should be avoided, if possible. Although if you're someone who's in a position to observe the shame and feel no sort of negatives from that, it can be fun. So I'm not going to like totally rag on shame because it can often be really funny sometimes. One of the other really nice things about containerization is you can see this little like bubble of interesting things on the side here. You can actually use containers to install your own tools as well. So instead of having Drush installed on your computer, which can be annoying, or having different versions of PHP installed on your computer, or having different versions of Node installed on your computer, you can have all these things installed as containers inside of our virtualization layer. So it's not going to mess with your computer at all. So you could actually run like Drush 7 on one site and Drush 5 on another site, and that's totally not hard, very easy to do, and it's great. So here's sort of a comparison of a Vagrant-based local development environment, which is what the first version of Kalabox was like, and the container-based version of Kalabox 2, which has been out for about officially out for about 4 months now. And you can see that the difference is quite substantial. So just to install the core product itself, it used to take about 15 minutes because we used to spin up this giant sort of stack and provision all these things for you. And now it's just a simple one-click install on Mac or Windows or Linux. It's cross-platform. Just installing a normal sort of Panoply Drupal 7 site used to take about 6 minutes. On the old Vagrant version, now it takes about 2 minutes. So your page loads are actually much faster, which is great because the faster your page loads, the faster your development time. On the old version, you could really just run one giant stack. On this new version, you can basically run as many containers as you want until your computer runs out of memory. Don't recommend doing that unless you're really just interested in the academics of it. And if you are interested in the academics of it, it's a couple of 100,000 containers for a normal computer. Yeah, and then the nice thing too is you can kind of use the same sort of thing. You don't have to get the tools that we give you. You can sort of spin up whichever ones you want. So I think that provides a good comparison of what sort of most development experiences look like with Vagrant and what the sort of new tech looks like using Docker and containers. There are a couple of OS-specific considerations, so I'm going to run through these really quickly. So on Mac, we use Xhive, which is their like sort of built-in virtualization tool, which means that if you don't have, you need Mac OS 10.10 and above to use this. And it uses the Docker for Mac tool if people are familiar with that. One of the really nice things that Kalabox does sort of out of the box is provides really fast file sharing. If you've used something like Vagrant in the past, you're probably familiar with NFS, which is also a fairly fast way to do that. But this combination that we do on Kalabox is substantially faster. So if you're annoyed with your pages going slow because your file syncing is slow, then this is something to look at. That all said, we actually do have a legacy version of Kalabox that runs on VirtualBox. And if you have an older version of Mac, you can use that version. We don't recommend that you use that version. It's a lot slower than the one that we have now, but it's something you can do if you so choose. And the other sort of caveat is Kalabox will try to bind onto port 80 and port 443. For those that are not familiar, those are the ports that run basically a web server and a secure web server. So we'll try to take those over. So if you're running something out on those ports already, we recommend that you turn it off. Otherwise, you probably won't get the same experience that you want. On Windows, you need to have Hyper-V installed, which means for right now, you basically need Windows 10 Pro or Plus. The Plus is sort of a misnomer. I think that just means like if you have like Enterprise. I think basically if you've bought Windows and it costs more than $200, you should be good. But you need to have Hyper-V installed. Again, if you have a older version of Windows, you can still use Kalabox. You just have to use our legacy VirtualBox version. We do require you to set up file sharing directly in the Docker UI. This is in our documentation, but just sort of a shout out for that now. It uses Samba for file sharing, which is also fairly quick. And like Mac, you need to have ports 80 and 443 open. And then this works on Linux as well. One of the nice things about Linux is we don't need any sort of virtualization layer because Docker runs natively on Linux. So it only works on Debian and Fedora-based Linux distros. So if you have Ubuntu or Mint, it would work on those things. If you have Fedora, it would work on that. I think on Red Hat, it would work for that. And if you're already using Docker on Linux, we actually spin up a whole separate Docker instance, so you can run them both side by side. So what can I actually run on Kalabox? What sort of sites can I run? What sort of development can I do? This kind of goes back to the discussion before about Kalabox being a product and a framework. So these are the things that come kind of with Kalabox as a product. The first and biggest thing is we have out-of-the-box support for Pantheon. And what that means is that you can use Kalabox to clone a Pantheon site to your local computer. So if you want to work on a Drupal 8 site that you have on Pantheon, you can install Kalabox, set up your machine token for authentication, and easily pull that site down. And I'll demo that in a little bit. And you can also use the GUI to pull in changes that other people have pushed up to that site, or to push out your own changes back to Pantheon. So basically, if people are familiar with Pantheon, you have this nice dev, test, and live sort of workflow. You can think about Kalabox basically just extending that to one more step, which is your local computer. And you can still transfer code in between your local computer and dev. So you're basically closing the whole loop and getting the entire Pantheon environment down onto your computer. Which is the next part of this, which is because of the awesome power of Kalabox and containers, when you pull down a site on Pantheon, you're not running on like MAMP or something like that. You're actually running on something very, very close to the entire Pantheon environment. So what I mean by that is we have the same version of Nginx as they do, the same config they have, the same version of Maria with the same config, Solr and Redis as optional services that work the same way that they do on Pantheon, and their sort of edge service and varnish setup. We'll also give you the same version of PHP that you have for your Pantheon site. You can check SSL, and we have all the PHP extensions that they have. So really, if you have something working on Kalabox and you push it to Pantheon, you should very much expect for it to work there as well, because they're very, very similar. So we have another out-of-the-box app, which is this PHP app. And so when I was making this presentation earlier, I did a PHP logo Google image search, and this thing showed up, and I just had to put it on here. I don't know if anyone's ever seen that before, but apparently that's in the result set. And I love it. I mean, I don't know why more people aren't styling their stuff this way because it looks really hot.
And a lefty mouse on that computer too.
Yeah. I mean, this before its time. It's for the 7%.
Inclusive. Yeah.
Also, actually, to bounce back to the Pantheon, and this will be later in the end of the Prezzo, but if you want to learn more about how this works, like very specifically, we have documentation at pantheon.kalabox.io that you can go to. So just want to point that out. I'll have that posted in the end of this slide deck as well. Anyway, on to the vanilla PHP apps. With Kalabox out of the box, you can spin up a WordPress site, a Drupal 7 site, a Drupal 8 site, or a Backdrop site. These use the official Docker images for these things, which means that they are very, very bare bones. They're going to give you the minimal requirements to run these things. So we sort of recommend that you only do this if you want to try these things out. I wouldn't be doing heavy development on any of these sort of things. So those are the two main out-of-the-box things that you can do with Kalabox right now. You can pull down a site from Pantheon, get the Pantheon environment on your computer, do development, push things up and down, get all the power tools, or you can spin up a PHP app and and try it out, give it a test run. We're going to be adding more stuff in the future. I'll talk about that later, but those are the two big things that we have right now. If you want to read more about how this sort of thing works, there's docs for this as well, php.kalabox.io. And then to jump more into the Kalabox as a framework, I don't think I'll get into this a ton unless people have questions for it, but it's very easy to build your own kind of apps as well. So if you didn't like our out-of-the-box offerings and because you really want to do front page 97 development, as many developers, former Drupal developers are now turning to, you could sort of build that yourself. And it probably wouldn't take probably actually would take quite a bit of effort to do a front page 97 app. But a Laravel app might be easier to do. So you can actually build out your own sort of custom stuff pretty easily. You can get high-powered, fast, containerized infrastructure running locally without having to learn a bunch of extra stuff. So here's an example of all the different things that you could use with Kalabox if you wanted to do customization. Trying to find a front page 97 logo, but apparently
they're gone.
They're not there. Microsoft has sort of done a deal with Google, and they're just not there anymore. So I'm going to do a brief demo of some stuff. But before that, does anyone have any sort of questions so far, or any thoughts?
Are you going to be going into in your demo how to swap out configuration?
What kind of configuration?
I was just thinking maybe some version of PHP 5.3 versus 5.7.
Yeah, sure. I can absolutely do that. Anyone else? All right. Let us demo some things. So this is the Kalabox website. If I wanted to download it and give the email, I'd go here and just do that. As I mentioned before, you can also go to the GitHub page and look in the releases section. And we post all the releases here as well. So you just want to download the one that makes sense for your computer. I've already installed Kalabox. Once you do that, you'll get at least on Mac, you'll get a nice little Kalabox logo in here. You can click on that to sort of run it, and it'll boot it up. I've already pulled 2 sites down. I'll go through the process really briefly. And then once you install, you'll also get this nice kbox command in the command line. Basically, all the things you can do in the command line, you can also do in the GUI. So it's really your preference. And all these things are documented in the links that I've already shared with you, and I'll share those later as well. So if you want to look at specific commands, like what the options are for them, I would just look there for those for now. So let's pretend that I haven't installed the site yet, and I want to pull down a site from Pantheon. I can launch this GUI application. I can click on this little plus guy in the corner. And I don't know how well you guys can see this, probably not very well. But there's a bunch of things here on the side, which I guess you can't really read. One of them is to add an account to Pantheon. If you click on this, it's going to ask for a machine token. Are people familiar with machine token authentication on Pantheon at all? So machine tokens, they basically just replace your username and password. We have a nifty little, if you're not really sure like how to make one or create one, we have a nifty little link here that you can click on, and it'll bring you to your Pantheon account page, so you can create one. And once you have it, you You can enter it in here and submit it. And once you do that, you can't really see this, but I have like four Pantheon accounts right down here. And these are all machine tokens that I'm off for Pantheon. I have a bunch of accounts because I do a bunch of different stuff. So I'm going to log in with just one of them, my mike@kalabox.io account. What it will do is it'll contact Pantheon and grab a list of all my sites on Pantheon. So you can see, or maybe not see super well, but here's like a really long list of all the sites I have on Pantheon. I have quite a few. You can go in, so I'm going to search for just like a normal Drupal app that I have on there. Got to spell it right for it to work. And click on it. And once I do this, it'll sort of go to the next step, which is to ask me what I want to call it. I'm not going to call it anything because I'm not actually going to go through this whole process. Then it'll ask me what environment I want. So if I'm using multi-dev, which you should because it's really great, this will list all my multi-dev environments. For this site, I just have a dev environment. So you can pull down multi-dev environments if you want to. And then you can optionally pull your Drupal files in your database. Generally, if you have a site that has gigabytes of files, it's probably not worth pulling them all down, especially with modules like file stage proxy or stage file proxy. I can never remember how it goes, which is a great sort of module for local development if you guys haven't used that yet. But we definitely recommend you pull the database down since that's sort of important for your site to work. But you don't have to do either of those if you don't want to. I'm not actually going to go through this workflow right now because I've already done it. But if I were to click submit, it would pull down all of my stuff. It would git clone my Pantheon repository. It would actually set up my SSH keys for me, so I don't have to do any of that if you're not sort of comfortable with that. Then it will pull my database down, pull my files down. And when it's done, I should have a Drupal site working. I've already done that, so I'm just going to spin up one that I have. At Kalamuna, when I was working at Kalamuna, we wanted a great place to sort of test the mettle of would-be applicants to join our company. So we created this Drupal 7 playbox or sandbox called Playbox, which is a site on GitHub that you can go to where users can sort of submit tickets and issues to prove their worth. And we wanted to think of sort of the weirdest thing that we could think of for this site. So the theme of the site is actually bosses from Mega Man against US presidents. Anyway, that is the theme of the site. But this is a site that is on Pantheon. You can see that I started it super quick in Kalabox. It took about 5 seconds to start up. And here it is on my local computer. Looks really great. So now let's bounce back to the Kalabox GUI and go a little bit deeper. You can see that there's start and stop functionality. I'll start and stop these. You can sort of contrast this with starting a Drupal VM instance or a Vagrant instance and how fast that sort of takes versus how fast this takes. Those can usually take minutes to start. This takes about 10 to 20 seconds, depending on sort of the computer that you have. But it's a fairly quick process. And what's funny is actually stopping them is, yeah, go ahead.
Is it actually stopping it, like destroying the box, or is it just pausing?
It's stopping all the containers that the app uses.
So if I were at this point, is A and 443 open, or would there be a conflict if I opened something else up and tried to run that? Yeah, that's a great question. So because each app runs on its own set of infrastructure, none of the apps themselves will bind to port 80 or port 443. We have a reverse proxy setup that's bound to that, and that's always running. So to make sure that that is not bound to port 80 or 443, you want to actually just turn Kalabox off completely. Great question, though.
I have a question similar to that. In Vagrant, you have halt and destroy.
Yeah.
Did you just halt?
More or less,
you still have the database, you still have the files that you downloaded.
Right.
It's just not running.
Yeah, and one of the nice things about and I'll actually maybe demo this later when we do the config thing about Docker, is you can actually have a separate container that just stores all of your data. By data, I mean in this case your Drupal code or your database or your files. So I actually can go in and destroy all the other containers. As long as I keep that data container and recreate them again, they'll bind back to that container, and I won't lose any of my data. So I actually could completely destroy all the containers and then spin them up again. It would still actually have my stuff in it.
Yes.
Sure.
Could I set up a CDN near, using this So to emulate, say I have a storage of data that I know is being created somewhere else, but it's not done yet, but I need to create those APIs and that sort of system talking to each other. Could I use this to simulate that using one container to store all that data? Could it talk to another container?
Yeah, you could. I think I would probably just recommend using Docker straight up for that, because that's functionality. That's nice functionality that's built into Docker. It's not specific to Kalabox, so I would check that out. But yeah, you can see I've turned the site off. I can turn it back on pretty quickly, and once it does that, we'll go through a couple of the other small things that you can kind of do through the GUI that are nice.
So I have a question. Are you saying that you're actually running all the different, like MySQL and you're running PHP, different containers?
Yep.
Okay, and so how are all the containers tied together in that instance you created up there?
Yeah, so behind the scenes we use something called Docker Compose. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but it's an orchestration layer for Docker containers. So we actually have, if people are familiar with Docker Compose files, they'll be pretty familiar with some of the stuff that is inside of a Kalabox app. So right now I'm inside of the code directory for the app that I just created, and this is sort of the Docker Compose file. And I can tell, here's all the different services that I have. So here's the data service that I just was talking about that stores all the data. And then here's the app server container. So this literally just is the PHP instance. It's not even the web server, it's just PHP. And you can see here I use this links key. So this basically tells my app server, hey, there's 3 other containers that exist. One is a database, one is Redis, and one is Solar. And you can connect to them just at database, Redis, and Solar. So if I wanted to connect to the database, the host name, as far as the app server is concerned, is just database. So you can use this nice links thing. It's good to use this locally. You probably want to use this like in production with Docker containers and stuff. But that's a great way to let other containers know about other containers. So that's sort of how we do it. There's a couple of sort of caveats to that. For example, like we have our PHP instance and our web server are actually in 2 separate containers. And in order for that to sort of work the best way, we actually share the socket file between the 2 of them. So yeah, here the site is started up again. I can click on this nice Actions tab, and I can do a bunch of really cool things. The first one is actually launch my code directory. So here's actually all the Drupal code that I have for my site. So if I wanted to go in and throw this into an IDE or a text editor or Vim or whatever, I can start to edit my Drupal code. All the Pantheon sites also come with Xdebug, so if you like to use that, you can use that. I don't remember what my life was like before Xdebug, so clearly I'm a fan. I just know that it was hard and my will to live was low, so I'd recommend you use it. You can also click on this nice terminal button, and that will launch a terminal up, also in your code directory, so if you want to do things in the terminal, you could do that. Then there's this pretty nifty connection info tab that you can click on, and this will load up a bunch of URLs that you can use to access this site, and it will also give you a command line string and connection information for your database. So if you wanted to connect to the database for this site using SQL Pro or your own sort of database tool, there's the connection string info to do it. You might also notice here that there's 4 URLs for this site. 2 of them are just for the normal Playbox site. One is HTTP and one is HTTPS. So if I wanted to just try out, how this works over that protocol, I can do that. We self-sign all the certificates because they're just local certificates, so you will have to go into your browser and go through that whole sort of thing. But once you do that, you'll be able to load your site in HTTPS, so you can test out that as well. The other neat thing in here is if anyone's ever used Pantheon and had cookies stripped out before, which if you've used Pantheon and done advanced Drupal stuff has most assuredly happened to you at some point, and you weren't really sure how to do that because it worked on your local computer, we actually have this separate URL called edge.playbox.kbox.site that you can go to, and that will actually approximate the Pantheon Edge server, which is Varnish and other things. So if you did want to actually test against that stuff, you can do that locally as well. So this gives you a bunch of nice little info that you can use on your site there. And then we have, as I mentioned before, sort of the push and pull command. So if somebody was committing code to this site on Pantheon and I wanted to grab it, I could click on this pull button and choose whether I want to pull down database updates or file updates, and click submit. And what that would do is it would actually pull all of the new code down from this instance, reclone the database, resync the file, so I would be up to date with what's on the dev instance. Conversely, I can do this push operation and type in a message and push. I can also push my database and my files. So if I'm someone who's like working solo and I just like want to push my database all over the place, this is the way to do it. If you are that person, you should highly consider using something like features and putting all your stuff into code. But you can push databases this way. So that provides a sort of linkage between this local site on your computer and the instance on Pantheon. So you can think about it as like an extension of Pantheon's own sort of workflow tools where you can push information between environments. So that's all the fun stuff that you can do in the GUI. There's even more fun stuff that you can do in the CLI. So here I am in the CLI. Is that readable to everyone? Maybe bigger? Make it as big as possible. So here's my two sites. I have Drupal 8 and Playbox. We're looking at the Playbox site right now. If I run kbox inside of this site, you'll see that I get a bunch more commands than I had earlier. There's the normal sort of global commands to create sites and list sites and power Kalabox off and show the version. But I also get app-specific commands. These are all commands that you just saw in the GUI. So starting and stopping and restarting and pushing and pulling and destroying. Those are all sort of normal things that people are probably familiar with. But one of the super awesome, excellent bonuses that come with Kalabox is we also ship in all the tools that you might want to use for a site. So you could think about basically going from, if someone had taken your computer and thrown it into the Chicago River, and you were like, I'm not jumping in there because it's cold as in there, and you're like, I'm going to buy a new computer. You could go buy a new computer, you could download Kalabox, and you could go from like 0 to complete working advanced development environment, including Drush and Terminus and all the nice tools in like 10 minutes. So not only are we installing advanced infrastructure for you, we're also installing recommended tools. So I can go in here into my code directory where my Playbox code is, and I can actually run kbox drush status, and it'll work just like a normal drush command. And that's pretty nice because, I don't know about you guys, but it's nice to install tools on your computer, but over time that just becomes a quagmire of pain that you have to deal with. You know, when you have Homebrew installing thing X and you have MVM managing your node versions, that causes chaos. You've messed all your permissions up, and you've come to a very sad place. The essence of objection, really, is what it is. Thank you. But you can see I can run my Drush commands here, so I could go in here and I could do, Drush ULI and get my nice login link and log into my site. I can also run Terminus commands. So if you're a Pantheon Power user and you'd like to use the Terminus, it's all in there, all set up for you. It'll piggyback off the user credentials you use to sign up, so you won't even need to log in. It'll all sort of be ready baked for you. So I can go in here, I can do my login link. And there I'm logged into my site using Drush on Kalabox. All sorts of awesome things. And just to give you sort of a brief example of the extra power that Kalabox has, Playbox uses Solr to index a lot of its content. Usually it's hard to develop on Solr locally. Pantheon's done a lot of nice things through its interface, so you can like post a schema and do that sort of stuff directly through the UI without having to do a lot of sysadmin stuff. We've set up Solr so that it does the exact same thing. Let's see if I can find that. So if people have done this before, Just like you do on Pantheon, you can go to post your schema on Kalabox, and it'll just work, and you can sort of do your Solr stuff right away. So it works the exact same way, just in a sort of give you a sense of flavor of how Kalabox is basically can emulate these environments really easily. At this point, I can go on and talk about more custom stuff, but does anybody have any questions or interested in particular areas at all?
Well, I'm interested in what can you, I mean, do you have, for instance, built in an FTP connector so you could push and pull from staging server instead of Pantheon? Because that's, for instance, I don't understand it at all.
Yeah.
I run my own web servers and mail servers and stuff. So how would this benefit me in that regard?
For right now, I wouldn't.
Okay.
One of the things we were focusing on, I'll go through the roadmap later. You could certainly create your own Kalabox instance. We might have some tools built into this that would make it easier than if you were to do it from scratch. But one of the things we actually are really interested in doing this year is, one, adding more hosting providers to the mix, but also providing some sort of like build your own app sort of experience where you could sort of pick and choose the services that you want and then provide either an SSH key and a link or a SQL connection string so you can actually connect to whatever sort of server you want to connect to. But as you can imagine, there's a lot more variability baked into a workflow like that. Pantheon is nice because it's always going to be the same thing every single time. Whereas, custom server A is not the same as custom server B. Like what I set up might be different than what you set up. So just a lot of thought has to go into the best way to do that. But it is something that we want to do pretty soon because we'd love to get more people using this.
Wouldn't they be able to develop locally using it and then communicate with FTP or SSH or Git how I normally would either?
Yeah, you could also do that. One thing that we do, it's easier for us since we made this thing so we know how to use it pretty well, but we don't do all of our sites on Pantheon either. And a lot of the times what we actually will do is we'll build the infrastructure locally exactly as it will be on production so we can test that. And then we'll actually run the same exact containers that we run locally in a production space. Normally we use something called Docker Cloud, which uses very similar language to what Kalabox uses. So we do that for a lot of stuff as well. And we set up sort of intermediate steps between local and production to test that stuff out. So we set up like Travis and like Circle CI type workflows to actually spin up the containers and test them and then to deploy them and stuff like that, which is more of an advanced workflow. But if you're a sysadmin person, you can probably do that. And it's a pretty good workflow, and it's pretty repeatable too. So if you have a setup that you like, just use the same thing on the next project that you have, and you're in a good spot. Does anybody else have any questions at all?
I have my super secret aliases that I have in my bash profile. Can I do that inside of the environment?
Oh, that's an interesting question. You can. You'd have to do a little bit of extra stuff. But if you open up a ticket on GitHub, we can definitely answer that question for you. That's actually a good segue into the sort of the next section of this, as a matter of fact, which is like handling configuration. So as we were sort of looking at before, and I'm sorry I can't make this like left-hand side that much bigger, but this is sort of the anatomy of a Kalabox app. This first folder is just the Drupal code folder. So that has the Drupal 7 code that we just pulled down. We also have this files folder, and that's just your Drupal files. So it's actually not in sites all or sites default files. It's one directory up and at files. And then we have a bunch of other folders as well. One of them is this config folder, which has, as you might imagine, config files in it for all the services that we run for Pantheon. So if you wanted to go in here and configure your php.ini, you could actually go in here and change that sort of stuff and restart the app, and those changes would take effect. Ditto for MySQL and Nginx and Redis, Solr. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail because that's sort of in the weeds, but just to give you sort of an example of what you can do, the power that you have if you want to get that low level with stuff. If you are using custom things like custom Terminus plugins or custom Drush plugins, you can actually, this like Drush folder will actually get linked to home.drush in the container. So we could actually do something similar with that, similarly like that with the bash profile stuff, where we can give you like a user folder and you just put your aliases in there, and then they get sort of dropped into the containers. But But if you had Drush, custom Drush command files or whatever, you can just dump them into this Drush folder for your app, and those commands will be available in your Kalabox Drush instance, which will be great. And you can do that for Terminus as well. So just a little sense of what that folder is all about. If people are familiar with Docker files, if you wanted to actually go in and edit some of these services, you can go into each one. So here's like the Pantheon Edge server. So if you wanted to go in and say, you know what, I know Pantheon uses Varnish 4, but I really want to use Varnish 1.3. Don't even know if that's a real thing. You could go in and you could sort of change that around and rebuild the whole instance out. So if you're someone who wants to sort of build out their own infrastructure, starting with the Pantheon app and going through some of this stuff and tweaking it the way that you want is not a horrible way to go.
So this is all per instance?
Yeah, so the model of Kalabox is all your services are for each app. So everything that you need to run an app is all in one repository. The infrastructure that you need, the tools that you need, the code that you need, it's all right there. But really easy to repeat this. Let's go on. Let's see. And then sort of the really easy to touch files are these core config files that we have in the root directory. And the main one is this kalabox.yaml file. And this sort of defines your app and all the stuff in it. So here's an app called Playbox. It's a Pantheon app. It uses this Pantheon plugin. And then here's a bunch of these config options you can read about in the documentation. I'm not going to go into them in detail because they are in the documentation. But you can change the way that the sharing is done. You can change what sort of services are exposed out to your computer and what the names of those services are. But the really nice section is this Pantheon section here, where you can go in and you can edit a bunch of different stuff here. The example that I'll show is this Playbox site runs on PHP 5.3. And what we'll want to do is just switch it over to PHP 7 really quickly. So one of the nice things that we do, or can do, let's see, is we do actually emulate the entire Pantheon environment. So if you're someone who's used to using things like Pantheon environment in your settings.php, I'm sure many people have probably done that before. You can do that. Always variables are defined on Kalabox as well. So a good example is if I wanted to use Redis locally, I could actually use the exact same snippet that Pantheon has on their docs on Kalabox, and that would work because we define the same sort of environmental variables. But anyway, you can see here that I'm running on PHP 5.3, which is a PHP version that I don't even think is actively supported. I think it's end of life, right? It's not even. So not good. Someone needs to upgrade this thing. And I'm going to say, you know what? 5.5 is kind of like whatever. I want to take this to the max, all the way to PHP 7 and see what it's like. So I can go in here, I can actually just change that to 7.0, as you probably saw. And then I can go onto the command line here and just run a kbox rebuild. And I'm going to run this in debug mode so you can see all the sort of fancy stuff that happens in the background. And this is actually an example of when you run a rebuild, it actually does what we were talking about before. We'll destroy all of the containers except for that data container and recreate them all with the new configuration. So what it's doing right now is it's stopping all those things. It'll remove them. It'll read that file again with the options. It'll spit up the new ones. It'll attach the data container back on, and we'll be good to go with all the new stuff. And hopefully none of these containers have gotten updates. If they do, we might have to pull one down briefly, but it looks like we should be good. So you can see now, you probably can't read it, but it says recreating a bunch of stuff, creating a bunch of new containers. So when this is done, I should be able to refresh that page and see that we're running on PHP 7. And if we don't, then you can all laugh at me, and I'll go get another beer. Yeah, question?
Yeah, well, for the command line stuff, is it best to open up the terminal from inside your Kalabox, or is it just any terminal will pop up and give you the kbox?
Yeah, we add it to your path directly, so you can open up any terminal. you can use any. I think on Mac you can use any shell. I think on Windows I think you have to use there's only a couple of shells that you can use. But I think Mac you can use like Fish or Zish or Oh My Zish or Zishjish or whatever people are using that ends in sh. So yeah, so I've completely rebuilt the app. So if you're a Vagrant person, you can think about this as basically re-provisioning the entire machine. So you can see that it's a lot faster to do it this way. So now when I click on this, the moment of truth, there we go, PHP 7. So awesome.
Same work?
That is a whole different kind of question. Whole different kind of question. Looks like it does.
Yeah, hey.
So it's good to know those Drupal 7 contrib modules are getting there. So I think I can certainly talk about this for much longer. I can also stop now. Do people have any sort of general questions about this beyond this, or anything else you'd like to see? Otherwise, we can just call it a day.
All right. Thanks much.
All right. Should I hit this thing or?